I sat quietly by the large window of my Chicago penthouse, watching the city lights stretch out like endless streams of thought. The distant skyscrapers flickered like silent storytellers, each window concealing lives entangled in love, ambition, and heartache. Somewhere out there people were laughing, embracing, fighting, living. But here, in the vast emptiness of my apartment, I was merely existing, a lonely woman in a glamorous world, listening to the sound of her own sighs echo in the silence. In my hand, the glass of red wine remained untouched. The dark liquid shimmered under the dim glow of the chandelier, inviting, intoxicating. But I couldn't bring myself to drink. Not because I didn't want to, but because I feared that once the alcohol touched my lips, I would lose the strength to hold back the storm raging inside me. Loneliness, such a simple word, yet it carried an unbearable weight. Daniel, my husband, was away again, buried in another business trip that stretched longer than the last. He was always somewhere else, always chasing success, leaving me behind like an afterthought. And yet, even when he was home, I wasn't sure I would feel any less empty. His presence had become as distant as his absence, like a painting once rich with warm colors, now fading into muted shades of indifference. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift back to the beginning, the days when love still lived in our marriage, when Daniel was my world and I was his. Back then, he looked at me like I was the center of his universe, held me as if letting go was unthinkable. But time had a way of unraveling even the strongest bonds. His ambition grew, and with every late-night meeting, every missed dinner, he drifted further away. Conversations turned into brief text messages, and my desperate attempts to reach him only made me feel more invisible. Dinner had become a ritual of solitude, a single plate, a full wine glass, and a woman sitting at a long, empty table. The ticking of the wall clock filled the quiet room, a cruel reminder of the hours slipping away. I sighed, reaching for the bottle to pour another glass, though I knew I wouldn't drink this one either. The Chicago night was cold, but the apartment felt suffocating. Sleep had long abandoned me, leaving behind endless nights of tossing and turning, of staring at the ceiling and wondering when I had started feeling so lost. Then the doorbell rang. The sharp chime startled me out of my thoughts. I frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late, too late for visitors. A strange sense of unease settled in my chest as I made my way to the door. When I opened it, I found Ryan standing there. Ryan, Daniel's senior manager. He wore a long gray coat, his hair slightly disheveled as if he'd had a long day. Ryan was always composed, always exuding an effortless confidence. His sharp eyes held an unreadable expression as he looked at me. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "Daniel asked me to pick up some documents." I sighed, stepping aside to let him in. This wasn't the first time Ryan had been here. He often handled work in Daniel's absence, appearing unexpectedly, always professional, always focused. But tonight felt different. I watched him as he moved through the apartment, shrugging off his coat and placing it over a chair. Usually he was in a hurry, but tonight he lingered. His gaze flickered to the glass of wine in my hand, then to my face. He studied me for a moment before speaking. "Long night?" he asked, his tone casual yet probing. Shrugged. "Something like that." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he picked up the file from the table, flipping through the pages with quiet focus. But I could feel it, his presence. It was heavy, commanding, almost overwhelming. Ryan wasn't like Daniel. He had an energy that was undeniable, a brashness that refused to be ignored. There was a sharp charm about him, a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and worst of all, he knew exactly how he affected people. "I've never understood," Ryan said suddenly, his eyes still on the file, "how Daniel could leave a woman like you alone so often." My fingers tightened around my glass. His words weren't just an observation, they were an invitation. I forced a laugh, trying to mask my discomfort. "He's busy. Work always comes first." Ryan finally looked up, meeting my gaze. And you, he asked. Where do you rank on his list of priorities? Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I wanted to dismiss his words, to end this conversation before it crossed a line. But a part of me, a part one didn't want to acknowledge, lingered on his question. The lonely nights, the one-sided conversations, the way Daniel barely noticed me anymore. They had all chipped away at me, leaving me vulnerable in a way I hated to admit. Some things are better left unthought of, Ryan, I said quietly, my voice trailing off. Ryan tilted his head, a knowing half-smile playing on his lips. But sometimes the things we try not to think about are the ones that haunt us the most. The atmosphere shifted. The air felt charged electric. My heart pounded in my chest, and I hated that he could sense it. I stepped back, putting space between us. You got the documents. I guess you should go. Ryan didn't move right away. Instead, he stood up, grabbing his coat, but before leaving, he stopped right in front of me, so close I could feel the warmth of his breath. Think about what I said tonight, he murmured, then walked out the door. I stood there long after he left, staring at the closed door, my thoughts unraveling into dangerous places. I told myself that night was the end of it, that I would ignore Ryan's words, forget his gaze, continue being the wife who waited patiently for her husband's return. But I was wrong. Ryan had planted a seed, and in the days that followed, I felt its roots take hold. Every time he appeared, the air in the apartment felt different. The conversations lasted longer. The silences between us grew heavier. I told myself it was harmless, that I was reading too much into stolen glances and casual remarks. But deep down I knew better. And then one night I stopped resisting. I let the lines blur. And once they did, there was no going back. The next morning, as I lay in bed beside Ryan, staring at the ceiling, the weight of my mistakes settled over me like a crushing tide. The room smelled of wine, of rumpled sheets, of regret. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. And worst of all, I wasn't sure I wanted to. But the universe has a way of making us pay for our sins. Daniel came home early. And when he looked at me that night, I knew. He knew.